Welcome to part one of this series where we'll be exploring two very important concepts, usability and cognitive fit. We'll begin with usability, which we skirted around somewhat previously, but now we'll flush out a richer understanding as this is a core foundational concept in human-computer interaction. Let's begin by taking a look at a website that is famous for its usability, and that is Google. But the Google of today has not always been what it is. In fact, if you take a look at an older version of Google, in particular, the year 2005, we can see a different version of Google's interface. Now, it's not all that different. There's some extra text, obviously, and the logo's outdated. Plus, it's somewhat pixely. For a brief period of time in 2005, however, Google actually tried to make this version of their site more usable by doing an homage to Mac's operating system, which at the time was called OS X. So they dubbed this new version of Google X, and they replaced their text with icons in an attempt to be more usable. But it didn't really work. For example, if you wanted to find direction somewhere, would you click on this compass or would you click on this thing that looks like a map? The meaning behind many of these icons is not super clear, and therefore what they do isn't really clear. The usability of this Google X is not all that great. Now, another famous example of usability, or perhaps a lack thereof, is seen with Windows 7, which launched with the expectation it would make PCs way more usable than they ever were before. Yet, famously, people hated it because it felt cumbersome. In fact, the first time I used Windows 7, it took me 15 minutes to figure out how to shut down my computer. Not a task that should take me 15 minutes to figure out how to do, even the first time. Now, both Google X and Windows 7 underscore a very important point, and that's that what is useful is not always usable. That is, these terms don't exactly go hand in hand. Windows and Google are incredibly useful tools, but their usefulness is significantly less impactful when their user interfaces are not usable, or not as usable as they could be. Now, to further emphasize this point, here are some examples of objects that are useful, but not necessarily usable. Here is what we refer to as the masochist teapot. It is useful, especially if you're a fan of tea and hot water, but it's not terribly usable because you can't pour out hot liquid without burning your wrist. Here's another example. A 360-degree panoramic camera system. This is definitely useful, since many of us have referred to Google Street Views when we're going to a new place to preview the surroundings. But this film version, this wearable film version of a 360-degree camera system just isn't really gonna cut it. Here's another invention that is useful, especially if you like enjoying hot soup noodles, yet it isn't very usable. Yeah, there's a big fan that's gonna get in the way. Yeah. Now, here is a back-scratching dream come true. If you've ever had an itch on your back that you just can't scratch, and you're having a hard time describing to someone else how they can help scratch it, well, you know what? You can just put on this t-shirt and give your back-scratching buddy this handy-dandy guide so they know exactly where in your back to scratch. Clearly, it's useful for that purpose, but is it usable? Probably not super usable. Here's an early version of a hands-free device for a cell phone. Very useful, especially if you're driving, but not super usable. Or check out this special pizza fork slash cutter. And this is very useful for those who don't like getting pizza sauce or grease on their hands while they eat. But will it be usable? I suspect not. And finally, as our recent pandemic experience has taught us, we need to wear protective gear, especially since germs and bacteria can be everywhere. So these finger protectors for smartphones certainly could be considered useful. But how usable are they going to be? Looks like they might be really hard to put on and take off. Now, all those examples, in case you hadn't guessed, or I should maybe say at least most of those examples, are intentionally humorous and ridiculous. But these are useful to look at. Useful, because they serve to help us understand the distinction that usefulness and usability are not one and the same. So when we say that an object or an artifact is useful, that means it actually does what someone needs it to do. And when we say that an object or an artifact is usable, or that a user interface exhibits usability, this means that we can actually use that interface in a way that allows us to gain the benefits of its usefulness. Now, I'm going to show you two more examples of designs which unfortunately are not quite as humorous as the ones we just looked at, but they do lead to important points we'll expand upon in subsequent videos. Obviously, this is not a computing-based example, as many of the ones we just looked at were not, but we're trying to just learn the concepts here. But the part I want us to focus on in particular with this example is the control panel of the stovetop. That is, the interface that the human interacts with to work the stove. What do you think? Is it usable? What about this design with the controls for the burners on the right-hand side? Is this one usable? Now, I want you to think about first which one is more useful, and I'll give you a hint, they're equally useful. Sure, we can have a debate about maybe the spacing of the burners, or that electric versus gas stoves may have some pros and cons we can debate, but overall, these four burners can generally do the same thing, so generally they're equally useful. Still, when we focus on how to use these burners, however, on their respective stovetops, which one is more usable and why? I invite you to place comments here under this video if you're viewing this in YouTube, and to share your thoughts on which is more usable and why, version A or version B. We'll come back to this in one of our upcoming videos in the near future, so we'll address that. But for now, we have an idea roughly about how usability and usefulness are not one and the same. In our next video, we'll begin sowing the seeds of a fundamental concept and additional concepts behind what goes into making an interface usable. So make sure you stay tuned for that.